2, 1. Good evening and welcome to Conversations, which is going to probably be calm. I don't know how excitable these two gentlemen are, but this is Dave Greene, the distributist, and Neil Shenvi, who is an author. Neil, what else do you do other than write tons and tons of books?
I
Articles?
tweet.
You tweet, which is another form of
Yeah.
writing.
Well, depends who you ask. I'm also a homeschooling theoretical chemist, so that's
Okay,
Ooh,
one
great.
of my titles.
You guys do stink bombs
awesome.
on Thursdays?
You know, my son is now 15, and he actually wants to be a cosmologist, and we talk about quantum mechanics. Believe it or not, he's been pushing me actually because he wants to know
Oh,
about
wow.
particle physics now. And I'm like, I'm not a buddy. That's a different field actually. But
Fun, fun, fun.
That's
Dave,
where I think I stopped my physics classes around the quantum mechanics level. I was like, okay, I'm just going to become an
you missed
engineer.
out. You missed
Yeah,
out.
really,
You
really.
missed out.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah. I'm great at statistics, so I could probably do statistical chemistry. I've got that down.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. So, but we're gathered here today to talk about this barb of a term or brilliant term. We'll decide over the course of the conversation. What is this woke right thing? Is it is the term itself just a bludgeon, or is it describing some sort of phenomena within the so-called right side of the discourse? So I'm going to let you guys map out how you want to map out what this term is, and then wrestle with what the
Okay, well, I
implications of it
think
are.
there is a critique from the right wing about this term, but I think I should let Neil introduce it first, so that I'm not just critiquing air.
Sure. Yeah. Let me just. Why don't I define how I use it, and then
Okay,
we could even. I can. Well, I'll define it first, and we'll just talk.
sure.
So I'll give you. I'll sort of document where I'm coming up with this stuff. So in 2020, that's what 5 years ago now. I sent out this sort of viral-ish tweet, 500,000 views, where I defined wokeness. This is the height of the Great Awakening. People were telling me you can't define wokeness. It doesn't mean anything.
Mm.
It's just a slur against progressives. So I said, here you go. So I said, wokeness in one tweet. Number one, society is divided into oppressor and oppressed groups along lines of race, class, gender, sexuality, etc.
Mhm.
Via two, hegemonic power. That's again yet the technical term, but it's not just who controls the factories like Marx thought. Hegemonic power is about narratives and stories, ideas that oppresses people. But privileged people are blind to that. So three, we need to defer to the lived experience of the marginalized. To number four, dismantle unjust systems. So it's a sort of fourfold definition of wokeness. I wrote a whole book about this, and last 2 years ago. So that's and people heard that definition and were like, "Huh, okay, yeah, we can kind of see that," and it resonated with lots of people, and they were saying, "Okay, this is a concrete definition." And actually, in our book, we've pointed out this is, if you look at the literature, this is a very, very good definition. Like people use this themselves, not those words. But anyway, so that was
Mm.
2020, and then I'll wrap it up here. But in 2024, in April, I tweeted out this. I quote tweeted the original wokeness tweet. I said, "Here's the dissident right in one tweet.
Mm.
One, society is divided into straight white men and their enemies via number two, hegemonic norms, the Longhouse, post-war consensus, Judeo-Christianity, etc. But normies are blind again. So three, need to red pill them. To four, retake the West." So basically, I have the same fourfold definition of the woke left and what came to be known later. I wasn't using it at the time, but as the woke right. So, and
Yeah.
a lot of people saw that definition, that symmetry, and said, "Oh yeah, okay." Now, again, I didn't call it the woke right; I call it the dissident right. That term came along later-ish, or I was aware of it
No,
later.
the
So that's
dis-
the
I, the
that's.
dissident row was being used in. I was in 2017 using that term.
Oh no, I meant the woke
Oh,
right term. I had
oh,
not
okay,
heard
yeah,
that
yeah,
yet.
yeah, yeah.
So and that's interestingly, Dave. That's a good point. So when I tweeted that out, lots of people said, "Oh," and actually, some guys that I think would consider themselves dissident right kind of agreed with that. They're like, "Yeah, we believe that." Then other people on the dissident right said, "Well, no, we're kind of elite theorists, and apparently there's a spectrum." So I was kind of scratching my head and
There
thinking,
certainly
I
is a
know this thing
spectrum.
exists. That's
Mm.
exactly right. And so I always aim with the woke left. I really struggled to find a good term that wasn't just slander. I wanted to say, well, it's clearly woke, but let's define that. I don't want it to be this pejorative. I want it to be descriptive. So I was trying to do that, and I was out later about why I use the term woke right rather than dissident right. But bottom line, that's how I define it. I never intended either definition to be pejorative. I want it to be descriptive. Yeah.
No, it's fine.
Go
And
ahead.
I think it's, I mean, I guess the criticism here comes in a few ways, right? So, I think that's a good definition of a bunch of qualities there are to what we would call the dissident right. But the question is, like, how relevant are the similarities between the left and the right to the point where it would be good to call both of them woke, and how useful is that? So, I mean, here's a good example. Like the left talks a lot about fascism. And, fascism is a real idea. And you can go to Giovanni Gentile and you can read about the ideology of fascism. But the way the left uses it is in this vague way that kind of like applies to all of their enemies. And, if you read Umberto Eco, who's another great author, he had a very famous article that aired in the 90s in the New Yorker, I think. And it laid out like the qualities of fascism. But the problem is that a lot of the qualities of fascism applied to huge swaths of human ideology. It was so general that most non-progressive ideologies qualified for at least half of them. And only a few of them were exclusive to the 20th century ideology that we called fascism. So what Umberto Eco is a brilliant man in his own right, and it's not a detraction on him, but what this definition allowed, progressives to do was because there was an overlap between various ideas in the past and fascism, they could use Umberto Eco's definition to kind of like group everyone into this terminology, even though those similarities weren't very relevant. Like two things can be similar and those similarities can't be relevant. An example I like using are, humans can eat oranges. Like a lot of animals can't eat oranges because it's toxic to them. Fruit flies can also eat oranges. Dogs cannot, it's toxic to them. But humans are more like dogs than they are like fruit flies, even though they can both eat oranges. And so, I do agree that the definition of woke right, and then when you're pointing to some of these things like hegemony, is like this is very easily something that is both on the dissident right and on the progressive left. And the reason why is it's originally a concept that comes from Pareto and Mosca, who are right-wing thinkers. Gramsci takes that idea and transfers it to the left, which is why Gramscian Marxism is in many ways a hybridization of Marx with right-wing ideas. And that goes on to influence people like Michel Foucault and all that stuff and the modern stuff. I guess the thing is, when we're talking about these similarities, my challenge is I don't think that those similarities are relevant to two different things that I think are like radically different from each other. The differences are much more relevant in my mind than the similarities.
Can we drill down for a moment into what hegemony is, and like why is that a false critique or a proper critique or something that goes off the rails and edges into wokeness?
So
I can go ahead.
So the woke left. Let's go to like Robin DiAngelo, author of White Fragility.
Yeah,
she
sure.
defines hegemony, and she clearly is thinking back to Gramsci and a long line of critical thinkers. But she defines it as the power of the ruling class, whether it's whites or men or heterosexuals, to impose their ideas on culture in a way that seems natural and objective and neutral. So that all of us are socialized into this system of thinking. We don't even realize it. We're like a fish in water. We can't envision other ways of living out society, of organizing society, because of this cultural hegemony. And she definitely overtly is thinking about Gramsci and her concept of hegemony. I mean, the word itself goes back before Gramsci, obviously, but she's referencing a Gramscian ideas. That's what, and I think the what people are calling the woke right, and we talk about this later, but they have a very similar idea about hegemony and what is the liberal hegemony we live in. But they're
So
also,
I mean, the idea is that ruling power structures create narratives that solidify their rule. This is what these people were arguing over who did it, but Pareto and Mosca. I'll just use both of them to not get into step into hot water. This is what I think Mosca called a political formula. And this is an idea that becomes very relevant in the 20th century because 20th century states literally form the ideology of their people. States before the 19th century do not have the technological capacity to do this very easily. They have to work with the religion and the folk beliefs that the people have. But 20th century states educate their population. So it becomes impossible to notice the descriptive reality that 20th century states and have ideologies and use this ideology to train people to obey their political formulas.
And the key is they're blind to
Orwell
it. The
pointed
key is
this
they're blind
out.
to it. Yeah.
Bernays pointed this out, right? Mark McLuhan pointed this out. This is like there's so many authors across the 20th century that recognize this reality. Sure, it does come through Gramsci too, but they needed Marxists needed Gramsci to rescue them from the materialist explanations of class, which were not sufficient to describe this reality.
So Neil, why is it important that people are blind to the hegemonic forces? So you do admit that there usually isn't a nation or a nation state, some sort of unifying force, some sort of unity of will and outlook that unifies people, and then there's a feedback loop where the state probably has more or less an intentional indoctrination of its populace in order to, not cause too many points of view. So is wokeness just this awareness of something that's invisible, or is it looking at something that is there and then critiquing it?
I'd say two things. One is that I don't deny that hegemonic narratives exist. There are just these innate subconscious narratives we have in culture that affect how we just think about reality. We don't take it for granted. I agree with that. That's sort of obvious common sense. And I give examples for conservative Christians of things like how, beauty standards. My girls walk around every day. They're 14 and 12, and they're just bombarded by Hollywood, Madison Avenue, pushing a certain narrative about their value coming from their appearance. Why is it so hard for me to raise them with biblical values? And the answer is because they're literally there's a hegemonic narrative in our culture about how women's worth comes from their beauty. Or take abortion. There's a narrative, my body, my choice. There's slogans, there's signs everywhere you go. That's the right people saying the right things, the celebrity. That's hegemonic power. So I'm not denying that exists. But so that's one thing. I want denying that. But it's often complicated. I think Gramsci tended to think in terms of like you were talking about, the regime imposes their ideology onto basically everyone. Everyone's brainwashed now. So the woke left, the critical race theorists, for example, would say, we're a racist nation that's been baptized into white supremacy, and you can't even see it unless you get a critical consciousness, which we'll come to, meaning you're woke, you become woke, you recognize suddenly, oh, I'm part of this racist nation. And that's basically the normies in there. They wouldn't call them normies, but people are blind to it. They have to get woke, achieve a liberatory consciousness to even perceive it. So I would say that those two things are problematic. One is that there's not just one narrative. So, for example, I'm in a homeschooling Christian co-op community. All my kids' friends are Christians. We have a very different narrative. If you're in our community, you'd be looked at as weird if you had the pro-choice slogans and narratives. So, and oftentimes, I think about regime change. I mean, Donald Trump just won re-election. He's bringing a very different narrative into his policies. Now, will it filter down into the DOE? I don't know. Department of Education.
That is the critical question of our time. Yeah.
But my only point is, it's the woke. I would argue on both sides tend to have this very contextless and uniform and homogeneous view of hegemony, and by definition, that's Gramsci's whole project. It's complicated.
Well, you can see how it comes from Mosca too, right? Because Mosca and Pareto are called the fathers of Italian elitism. And their thesis was that ideas generally they start from the top and go to the bottom. And so this is kind of ironically a difference between left and right is the left likes this because they see racism. The left has a huge problem in that they are unable to create the racial egalitarian systems that they promised people to generate in the 60s. They promised this, they were not able to deliver it, and they are in crisis. And so their story is that there's a top-down hegemonic flow of ideology that is racism. Ironically enough, the right believes that most racial conflict is organic, that it sort of bubbles up from implicit and intrinsic qualities of the human creature, and that this is sort of like weeds growing out of the ground, and maybe you'll never be able to get rid of it in all probability. But you can see, I mean, Mosca and Pareto believe that for the most part, and there are some exceptions, right? For the most part, ideology is top down. The elite believes something, and then it becomes the belief of the masses. So, for instance, a great example is Robin DiAngelo. Now, I come from Northern California, not Berkeley, but nearer Berkeley. And there is not an idea that Robin DiAngelo has ever said that was not being said in 1992 in Berkeley. It was all there beforehand. And that's because, and the same thing is true for Harvard, right? You could see this stuff in like Noel Ignatieff, right? This is not new. What's new in the Great Awakening was that this idea filtered down from the higher education centers into the general population. And that's how most ideas work. Now, there are some exceptions, some populist ideas. Trump is very much a creature of the internet, which is why I think, he's going to have a hard time getting his hegemonic ideas into play. But I don't know. I look at the history of the 20th century, and most of the effects are ideas that come down from the powerful to the powerless. That just seems to be the pattern for the most part, with some minor admitted exceptions, certainly.
Yeah, so my first point was just that I would just dispute the idea that there's just one narrative out there and that it controls everybody. And the fact that Trump won the election is kind of evidence that at least half the population is not buying that, whatever you want to call it. If the elites, who are generally progressive and pushed wokeness on us, they truly had the power to just control all of us, why was Trump elected twice?
Well, I mean, I don't think the theory has to be that there's only one narrative. I mean,
okay, that's an important point. Yeah,
sure. I mean, but some narratives are, something like we could just take common. So, for instance, like I know Ben, you've discussed this with Aaron. Like the idea that slavery was okay was a narrative that was. There were ancient critics of slavery, but they were a vast minority. In the present day, you can't find a single defender of slavery. I mean, some sweatshop worker, defenders notwithstanding, that's kind of stretching the definition there, right? So, like the idea that we can't come up with ideas that are hegemonically dominant is also like there's just some things that are there are some things that are inside and outside of the Overton window, and most of the time, what changes Overton windows, according to the Italian elitists, are sort of rival elite groups of people who say, no, this idea that you think is anathema, we think that this is actually something that needs to be part of the discussion. And, that may be happening with Trump. And, Trump's big idea was immigration restriction. And that was for the longest time something that was just not discussed in elite American circles. It was a populist whining point, but it was not a serious contender inside elite government positions.
So go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say that recognition that, there's actually more than one narrative, and you can see that just in our election cycles. That's important for the second objection I have, which is that if you posit one narrative, or at least one sort of really dominant narrative, which in some cases I'd agree that it exists, like the slavery thing, that is the dominant narrative. It's really hard pressed to find someone out there being like publicly slavery was great. And thank goodness there's not. It's a good thing that it wouldn't have shifted the way it did. But the fact that we say that, actually, though, there are actually competing narratives in a lot of places, this is important. This is huge. Because one of the major problems with wokeness in any form is that they can argue basically that you are blind. You can't understand the reality because you're still immersed in the hegemonic narrative. And you have to achieve this enlightenment. And that's why for a longest time, again, this was my objection to left-wing wokeness, that they wouldn't appeal to evidence and reason and logic.
Well, yes, thanks.
Okay.
Thanks.
I have 4 kids.
Actually,
I understand.
This is happening to me. This is happening to me. Sorry, one second here.
No, take your time.
All right,
I have 4 kids.
pick up something, Neil, just to drill down into what
Actually,
you're saying
yeah,
about.
let's. Sorry about that. The interruption. I completely lost my train of thought. What were you saying?
So the admission that there's multiple narratives, that is really important, because what the woke left would do is say, we live in a racist hegemony, a white supremacist nation. They pull out all these statistics. And if you said, oh, wait a minute, look at these, let's drill down into this data. It's not saying what you're saying it says. And in fact, they're like, well, but you can't see it because you're immersed in white supremacy yourself. You have to achieve this higher consciousness, liberatory consciousness, and then you'll just know it's there. And in fact, I'm a person of color, and so I have this double consciousness. I can see things you can't. That's deadly. It's actually a fallacy that C.S. Lewis coined, bulverism, the idea that you don't want to see it. Your privilege and power are blinding you. Well, the problem is that way of thinking, that fallacy, can come from anywhere, left or right, and it's dangerous. But the fact that if you're willing to say, actually, there's multiple hegemonies, well, then I no longer can say there's just one thing blinding you, and therefore only one blindness out there, and if you're on the wrong side of it, I can ignore you. You say, actually,
it's definitely poisonous for conversation to make the assumption, like the bulverism thing, that your opponents are blind. But I mean, it is a little true. The thing is, the problem with these things is that these are deadly to discourse. So we have to exclude them for the presumption of good faith inside a conversation. But it is absolutely true that we have a very difficult time considering ideas that are kind of outside the realm of acceptability inside our given time. So ideas that we were raised with to think as being ultimately really, really good or unquestionable. A good example is democracy. This is a great one. I mean, no one's ever been no one has had an experience with democracy that's been positive, but everyone thinks it's good. Like, have you ever voted on an issue that had like a financial obligation attached to it? Like, if you're part of a housing co-op or like a co-op that you're managing where there's like a huge sum of money that you have to vote on, people usually list that as like a very, very bad experience, and they'll do anything to get around it. But then they'll go on to say like democracy is great. Well, people's opinions that democracy is good, it's not historically common. Most people in history have thought democracy is bad, even our founding fathers. And most people have negative experiences with democracy, yet they're programmed into the response that, oh, democracy, that means good. And so like, it's very, very difficult to get people out of that mindset once you've been raised with it. And if there is an important issue or something that's essential for your society to understand that lies on the opposite end of one of these sort of culturally indoctrinated or these culturally hegemonic ideas, then people are going to have a very, very difficult time seeing that reality.
So I agree. It's not just for me that it ends discourse. I would argue it actually ends reason, because it's an informal fallacy. Like, a bulverism it's not how you reason properly. So I think we have to exclude it. I agree. And I'd actually agree with you. Of course, we all have assumptions that are unquestioned. And it is harder to think through my blind spots. They're called blind spots because I'm blind to them. And yet we can't appeal to those blind spots to prove that we can't assume our opponent has those blind spots in order to force our point across. We can't just say the only reason you believe in democracy is because you're brainwashed. Well, that's possibly true.
In a conversation, yes. But the thing is, it's like, if you wanted to control power in the state, that'd be a different question, right? Like, because most people aren't like, I'm going to have a debate about whether the ideas of the government are true or not. They just go with what the government says, because the government has propaganda. And propaganda has a narrative. So, I mean, like, Hungary is a great example. This is a country that it's kind of sort of it's very near the place that my grandparents came from. In the 30s, everyone was fascist. And then like in the 40s, everyone was communist. It changed like overnight. Like, the people in Budapest they have jokes about how quickly this changed, and it changed with the government narrative and the propaganda being put forward.
I mean, look at Zuckerberg today. He's like, free speech is all the rage now. So Yeah, he's following the trend.
Maybe that's a part of dialectic, right? But it anthropologically is true that for masses of people, like in a conversation, we're being calm, we're being friendly, we can reason things out. But inside a mass of people that's being influenced by media and has an average IQ of 100, it's going to be narratives and propaganda that win all the time. So, that reality is just acknowledged throughout the 20th century. We can see it. And to pretend like we're immune from it just is, I don't know how we can talk about politics realistically if we pretend like we're immune from it.
Well, I'm curious then. So if you think we're in the mass of people, I'm not saying that you wouldn't apply Bolivarism in this conversation, for example.
No.
It's great. Good. I'm glad.
Well, you guys just can't see it, but I see it happening.
Well, good one.
Thank you,
good
Ben.
one.
That's a good illustration of the problem, is because you've thrown a reason out the window once you've done that. Like, well, you can't understand me because you're not woke. You can't understand me because, but you're arguing that the masses are always just it's like a law of politics or a lot of societies, that the masses are always in the 20th century, they're going to be brainwashed into the narrative. But I'm curious, how do you explain then? I think there's no question that the prestigious elite narrative for the last 4 years has been Trump's going to end democracy. Trump is literally Hitler. We got to keep him out of office. This will be our last election if he wins.
Yeah. And
he won. If propaganda they just control, they can switch from fascist to communist in a matter of years. And now we have the internet, technology, we have deep fakes, we have fact checkers, and yet Trump won.
I think that Trump would not have won without the internet. I think the internet's a necessary component of Trump's ascendancy.
Don't overlook the amount of work that so many people put into fighting the narrative of the Democrats.
But you can. Right? That's my point.
Democrats. Okay. I mean, narratives can shift, right? And like that's part of the theory. Like that. But it's not like there can never be any preference cascades. That's not the elite theory is if you're trying to convince a mass of people. And don't show up in front of a mob that's being subjected to propaganda with a list of syllogisms written out in logical form that will never work. That's what the theory says. It doesn't mean that there can never be preference cascades or there can't be alternative elites that emerge and create counter narratives that
who were the elites that were? I mean, I guess Elon Musk has got to be the biggest name I can think of with access to like social. But you think Elon Musk single-handedly unbrainwashed or alternately brainwashed?
No, that's not how I would put it. The internet the internet opens up an avenue for people for which populist swells can essentially gain power by surging during election years. This is basically so the internet created the possibility for flash mobs. And Trump, well, Trump's not the only person to figure this out. People in the Arab Spring also figured this out. People across the world have been slowly figuring out that you can flash mob elections to force the media to cover a certain thing. Now, so in some ways, this is like the 20th century technology feeding back in on itself. In the early 20th century, all the technology for mass media was controlled by the state, which is why you had these totalitarian states become ubiquitous during that time. And I include Roosevelt among those people. Although not quite as hard-handed, obviously, as Stalin or Hitler. So the existence of social media allowed for populist leaders to come to the fore in a way that they had a very difficult time doing before. I mean, an example of a populist leader who broke narrative with the media in the 30s would be Huey Long, who my friends, the good old boys, I think you might have had them on your show once or twice, Ben, but cool. They talk a lot about Huey Long. He's this populist leader from the South, and the media hated him. But he was able to get huge regional sway based on a populist appeal. But eventually, he got assassinated. But eventually, this dissipated because in order to go from a regional appeal to a national one, you need national media control. And the dying of the mainstream media and the emergence of social media allowed for essentially an upheaval of the media narrative that was dominant in the later half of the 20th century.
But what about like the Newt Gingrich in the big midterms was 90 whatever the promise, that was also a populist movement that did not happen. It happened before social media, really, the internet even really not didn't take off. It was in the 90s. So how do you explain
Yeah,
that?
I mean, I look, unpopular searches happen. It was a lot less. It was a lot smaller than the Trump one, and it had almost no impact on the overarching narrative of America or the American media class. There's no evidence of Newt Gingrich's revolution in '96 that can be seen anywhere outside of a few reformed welfare programs. You know, when FDR took over the country in what was it, 1932 or whatever, like every institution of the country, all areas of the media, of the higher education, of the federal government were made over, and the ideology of people that came after 1946 is unmistakably different from the ideology of the people that came before. This is not the true for Newt Gingrich. The people who were educated in 2001 had in some ways less Gingrichian ideas than the people who were educated in 1991. So, I mean, like little populist surges happen, but they need to be able to take over media and education in order to become permanent. And that is why. Well, that's one of the reasons why the left has seen. This is something that I don't know if you guys notice on your end of this debate, but the left has won like every major cultural battle for the last 100 years, hands down. And maybe it could take an L now, but it can only take permanent L's to the extent that it loses control over the hegemonic levers of education and media. If those are loosened from its grip, then it can lose permanent battles. If it can't, if those controls are not loosened, it will not lose permanent battles.
So one thing I'd simply say is that this seems like your theory is unfalsifiable, because like if a populist surge happens to counter the hegemony, well, that was a fluke or something happened to allow that, but otherwise it was the elites or a different group of elites stole got the election the way they wanted. But how would you falsify your theory?
Well, I mean, it's hard to falsify theories on counter positives. The theory only says that in the majority of time. So maybe we'll test this out. Would you say that ideas appear first in the lower classes and then move to the upper classes, or do they appear in the upper classes first and then move to the lower classes?
I mean,
there are some exceptions. I can think of one exception. The exception that exactly, and that is. And that this came up last time in my conversation with Local Distance. That is almost miraculous how that happened. That happens so rarely.
A miracle?
That happens. I would. Statistical things have a hard time being called miracles. That happens so rarely that an idea goes from the lower classes to the upper classes. Yeah, that is almost. But if you're looking, it's very hard to think of other, like communism. Obviously, does not emerge from the lower classes. Communists say that it does, but it does not. Like every single time you can do this, and we can do this right now, it always emerges in the upper classes first. It always emerges among the intellectuals. Mm-hmm. They say according to communist theory, this is one thing that Gramsci, this is what made him so unorthodox among Marxists. Marxists were like, the ideas of communism will emerge from the workers. And Gramsci is like, well, what the hell are you talking about? They telling the workers aren't talking about this. It's the only people who talk about this are the intellectuals, because they're the only ones that can break from all the workers in Italy are all supporting Mussolini. Well, and here I am in prison. Right?
So I'm not a political theorist, but off the top of my head, but there are things like the Arab Spring you just mentioned. That was not top down, right? What about things like
it was
Berlin Wall?
Okay, first,
the Berlin Wall.
The Arabs. The Berlin Wall and the Arab Spring both were essentially functions of the U.S. State Department policy. The Berlin Wall was essentially an elite that already existed in the Soviet Union getting the signal that it was time to just take over the government. And the government of East Germany was weak enough. The Arab Spring also had help from the internet. And there's a reason why the Arab Spring happened in the Obama administration and not the Bush administration. And social media was more mature. It wasn't because like the story is like the Arab Spring happened because all of these dictators were way more abusive in 2011 than they were in 1999. No, they were way worse in the 80s and 90s, and people hated them way worse when they were murdering people in the 80s and 90s. The reason why it happened was A, social media, and B, the Obama State Department felt that it was time to get rid of these dictators in the Middle East, which I think was a mistake. But obviously people like Susan Rice didn't. So and Hillary Clinton didn't feel this was a mistake. So but without those components, the things don't happen. So the question is when you look for, I want different ideas to come to the fore, what you're looking for is a cooperation between an elite that's kept locked out and then a population of disaffected people at the bottom who can work in concert.
So, what about French Revolution? I mean, I guess there are always going to be leaders.
No, it's certainly not elite. That was
behind it.
100% elite. 100% elite in that one. 100%.
Okay, so you're saying. So how are you defining elite thing? It seems like you're just saying, well, anytime there's a movement and there's a leader, that's an elite actually. But there's always going to be leaders.
No. Because you can look at things where there weren't. I mean, like let's look at other exceptions, right? Like the French Revolution or the American Revolution were led by elites. Like Thomas Jefferson was not a slave. George Washington was not a slave. Or Robespierre was not a slave. Spartacus was a slave. Like so Spartacus would be an example, an attempt of regime change from the bottom down. The Haitian Revolution, although it had kind of some help from French radicals on the sidelines that made the suppression of that rebellion difficult. It was genuinely like the Haitian Revolution is a good example of what a bottom-up revolution looks like, and it is not pretty. Those things are.
And why is it not pretty? Because they don't have, without elites, you don't have the people who have the capacity to organize the new regime.
So what happened in the Haitian Revolution is there's an initial revolution, and then the more reasonable people immediately got murdered by the people under them, and then the people under them got murdered by the people under them, and because there was nobody who could keep the revolution in charge, it was just everyone murdering everyone until the most crazy people got in charge, and then people have heard the stories about that. They
murdered
all of the not only all of the white people, all of the non-black people in that entire island got just completely destroyed, and that's because you had this kind of Game of Thrones style chaos that emerged from a changing government that was not properly controlled. It's important to understand that our founding fathers were not like. These people were not only were they not slaves, they were not
lawyers.
Workers. Not only were they not workers, they were not skilled tradesmen. Not only were they not skilled tradesmen, these people were like the people who were. I mean, like if we were to use the caste, they were a mixture of We want to use like Curtis Yarvin loves using the caste system because it applies, right? They were a mixture of Brahmins and warrior castes, right? They were the elite of the 13 colonies, and there were a certain segment of the elite. There were Tory elites as well, but these people who were guiding this revolution. This was not a bottom-up revolution.
Can I arc the conversation? We don't have to change what we're doing now, but I want to arc the conversation into something that I think is salient to define the woke right, at least as I see it being used. Now, I don't like the term because I think it's a political term to separate and to geld certain factions within the right that are trying to push their own agenda within this very brief moment of possible rightward swing of the elites. But one thing that is a sticking point is racial or collectivist consciousness. You see in the left, at least over the 2020 period, the left really leaned very heavily into race. They made everything about race, and that's where a lot of the woke stuff found most of its purchase. A lot of the hoodwinking of people was affected around casting certain races as at the bottom of the pile, and we need to lift them up because that's the fair thing to do. That's equity. There is a undeniable racial consciousness within sectors of the right that I think people who are on the center right they're the ones who are using woke right to point to. That's the only thing that actually makes sense in all these definitions of woke right, is that people are either against or skeptical of Israel / are for or are against skepticism of a racial consciousness, a European / white racial consciousness. So I think
I want to clarify. I am a complete Israel agnostic. I am just an isolationist on that country. So
you want them isolated, or you want isolation from them?
I don't think I think the American, well, I think the American government needs to take a big time out from trying to figure out who rules the Middle East. I think that this has been a disaster, and I include our Israeli policy as part of that disaster. So, but I think what you're pointing to, Ben, is that the dissident right is much more comfortable with collective identities, and that is a big similarity between the dissident right or whatever, and I think that's what people like James Lindsay find so objectionable, right? Is we say, like, look, these identities are a reality. These have to be part of our political conversations, and just kind of leaving these realities as unaddressed, except by how they're addressed by the progressives, is just a formula for defeat. And I talked about this, and I think you might have read the article about Poseywood, about how the reason the big disadvantage on the conversation on race in America is that the left addresses a collective problem and the right refuses to. And the problem is fundamentally collective. And individually looking at the problem always misses the actual point about what people are angry about.
Neil, what do you think about collectivism, just from your own point of view, and how does that factor into wariness or critique of certain aspects of the right that are not uncomfortable with it?
Right. One thing is that I don't think all ethnic identity, I use ethnic rather than racial for reasons I can talk about, but ethnic identity is not inherently bad. I mean, I'm an evangelical Christian, so I go to the Bible and find Paul rejoicing in being Jewish. It was his ethnic identity. But so it's not like it's an anathema. Like, you can't say, "Oh, I'm half Indian. I like being half Indian. I've been to India. It was nice." That's fine. When I see an Indian man, a random guy, I'm like, "Oh, it reminds me of my dad." Like, that's like, oh, you can't be colorblind. It's nonsense. It's like, you can notice ethnicity and feel even a familiarity and a happiness about. That's fine. What I worry about is two things, and this is okay. And this is a good point. I think some people look at the phrase woke right as a pejorative. Like, you don't like wokeness, so you slap woke on the right to marginalize these guys it's not fair. And the reason why I've adopted that term, one is I borrowed it from, not James Lindsay even, I borrowed it from other Christians who are, interestingly, one of them is Doug Wilson, he was a Christian nationalist. So he's very, 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 very conservative. Not just conservative, but on the right. Published Stephen Wolf's book on Christian nationalism. But he talked about how he was concerned with the woke right and brought up racism and anti-Semitism as a thing that was really, he was worried about that.
Is there a difference between racism and anti-Semitism, or is anti-Semitism a special form of racism or an elite form of racism, or is it the same thing? Just wonder why.
So I think usually anti-Semitism, and again, I would boil it down to this. These are all forms of the sin of partiality. Now, obviously, I just said it's okay to be partial to things like your family, even your country, people but problem in the Bible is
but not negatively partial.
Not even that. I actually argue that when it's not, your loves are not rightly ordered. Here's a simple example, right? And this Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan, parable of the Good Samaritan, if you're not familiar, you guys, I'm sure you are, but for the audience, a Samaritan who was hated by the Jews, a Jewish man, is walking along the road. He gets robbed and beaten. And a fellow Jewish man, a priest, sees him but walks by. Then a Levite, who's also like sort of priestly caste, sees him, walks by. But then a Samaritan man, who is not of his ethnicity, who's actually an enemy of his. The Jews and the Samaritans.
A heretic.
Yeah, a heretic. That's right. He was a religious, social, ethnic outsider. Walks by, sees him, has pity on him, binds his wounds, cares for him, pays for his stay at the end, and then Jesus is being asked, well, what is it? Who's my neighbor? And Jesus says, be like that guy. It's not a question of who your neighbor is, but who you're being a neighbor to. Jesus commands us to love our neighbor as ourselves. And that means anybody in our path, whether it's a person of an outside racial, ethnic, religious group, doesn't matter. So Jesus pointed this. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I mean, racism is kind of a good example of this because you had the problem is history existed before the 20th century, and
Did it though?
you see how so Christians conceptualize this differently. So what you're saying is perfectly fine about the Good Samaritan, right? But first of all, racism it's a term that comes from what the American version of residential schools. It's a progressive Christian term. The only reason why racism as a word becomes popular is because communists. It is essentially a communist word that communists took from Christians. The word before that was bigotry. And bigotry basically is not about like showing a preference towards your own people or not. It's about essentially saying that somebody that treating somebody as morally inferior because they come from a different group. So it is very much like, so if I'm a judge and I'm supposed to adjudicate on the law, and then I decide to favor my own race or people, then I'm guilty of bigotry. Or if I treat someone as morally worthless because they come from a class or an ethnicity that I don't like, then I'm also guilty of bigotry. But through this word racism, we have transformed this injunction against bigotry, which I think is what Jesus was alluding to, into this much broader concept. Because for my entire life, the idea of not being racist was you have no expressible political preference for any people based along genetic lines. And this is just ridiculous. Christian nations have always constituted themselves along ethnic lines. This is how countries were divided up into regions and among rulers. Before that, people have always shown preference to their kin when it's come to determining who to live with, as long as it didn't violate a structure of the law by which they vowed to judge people equally, as in a judge or a magistrate. And these kinds of divisions and special loyalties were always permitted inside Christian societies. And I believe that the newfangled term racism, which is a complete product of the 20th century, doesn't exist before then, it was designed to confuse these two very, very different ideas, and to essentially use the Christian injunction against bigotry to say that there's a Christian a moral requirement for total universalism and total ethnic non-particularism.
Okay, so let me say a couple of things. I don't mind using the term ethnic partiality, because partiality is actually named as a sin, not just bigotry, partiality. And so that's I don't mind switching the term.
Is this in Paul or
no? Partiality is there's injunctions in Leviticus not to be partial in judgment, but also in I think it's in 1 Peter, where Paul says we serve a God who does not look partial on anyone, who basically is not, and then we should not be partial. So basically, we're modeling God's impartiality.
Can you have familial partiality?
Oh, so that's exactly right. So there is a rightly ordered loves, like Augustine talked about, the order amoris, where, of course, you should love your wife and not everyone's wives. Like, I'm not like, oh, I'm so universalist, I love everyone's wives equally. No, I love my wife over my neighbor's wife. Actually, that's not just...
So you can have partiality to kin.
Yes, yeah. Okay, no, so let's take it one step at a time.
slow down.
Slow down. So
I think you're going to try to imply that there's a bright line that there really isn't. I think
I'm really interested in listening to.
Sorry, go. I didn't interrupt you. Go ahead.
Sure. So in the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus is asked, "Who is my neighbor?" by a man who wants to justify himself. Basically, limit my neighbor. Like, who are you talking about? It can't be Jesus. It can't be literally everyone. You're crazy. No one can do that. And that's Jesus' point. No, you can't. That's why you need grace, because you're breaking God's law. Yes, the law requires you to love your neighbor as yourself, and that means loving, for example, the enemy, the outsider, the racial, religious, social outsider. That's what you're called to. And
the person that's outside your nation.
No. Listen. Who is that guy, though? The guy on the road, in his face, in his street, who needs help. He's not saying, oh, you have to love the random person in Tibet you've never met and never will meet. He doesn't say that. Your neighbor is the person in front of you at the moment. That's Jesus. And what does the guy do? The guy is horrified because he's like, now he realized, the guy who asked the question, who's my neighbor? He realizes, oh my goodness, that's what God requires. I don't fulfill God's law. And Jesus is basically saying that's the point. You need a savior because you do sin every single day. Now, what does it go
now, you understand this has
thing?
huge problems with defining boundaries for nations and communities, though.
Oh no, yes. So we're not talking. This is exactly in my worry because we're talking about politics.
This has never been used as a way to say that we cannot have boundaries for who is inside and outside. Okay,
I'm not saying that. I'm saying our moral duties that Jesus himself commands to us is to be a neighbor to the person on our path, regardless of their ethnicity, their religion, whatever. Do unto others as you would have them do to you. It's a golden rule, right? And Jesus is saying you can't limit that. Do not say to me, oh, but look, but he's a Levite, he's a Samaritan, he's black, he's white. No, he's in front of you. Treat him like you'd want to be treated. If you were lying there, would you be saying, I don't want help from a black guy? Yeah.
I'll give you an example. Like, I am an American living in Canada. So like these people are not of my nation. I'd obviously help them as if they were my neighbor because I'm living here. Right. That does not mean that we can't have particular loyalty to America or Canada, correct?
No. But it's
okay.
ordered.
Perfect. So so perfect. But that applies to all groups, from family to so there is a special responsibility we have to proximity. So I am in proximate to Canadians. That means that because I'm proximate to them, I have to help them and render to them the charity that Jesus says. That does not mean that all Canadians are, I have to regard them in the same way that I regard Americans. I have special responsibility to Americans because they are my co-nationals. And the same thing applies to family and ethnicity, right? Like there can be, there are special things I owe people to my neighbor because they're proximate to me, because my actions can immediately impact them. But that does not destroy my special obligations to my family, my special obligations to my ethnicity, my special obligations to my nation. Those two things can exist at once. And Christian scholars throughout the ages before the 20th century said those things could exist at once.
Right, but they have to be, but they also they have to be rightly ordered. So here's an example. Let's say, and this is a very real example, right? Let's say that I call these people that are racism skeptics. I'm not saying it's you. I'm just saying people argue this way that well, I have a special duty to my family, right? And I would say yes, you do. Yes. I agree with that. And then, well, like my immediate family, my parents love obey your father and mother, my kids, yeah. And then extend outward to like my uncles and aunts, sure, and like my my extended family, of course. What about my neighborhood? Not just my household, but people next to it. Yeah, of course. And they say, well, what about to my tribe or my whole ethnicity or my whole language group, my whole country?
Or your nation.
Their nation. There are these circles of obligation.
Why is that? But that's true. As you go out from the family ethnic group to the town, you still have special obligations. So so obviously the nation is typically larger than your ethnic group. Typically, there are exceptions, right? And depending on how you define ethnic group, you can define it broadly enough so that it goes outside the nation and the diaspora. But I am perfectly comfortable as a Christian saying that you have special obligations to your family, to your ethnic group, to your nation. I have no problem saying that, and Christians have had no problem saying that historically. If someone's an Armenian or like St. Paul, a Jew, right? Like they are particularly able to help the Jewish or Armenian communities. And I'm not surprised that they use that to say that I have a special obligation to this community because that community is essentially what gave me so much in terms of my language and my history and my culture. Now, that does not mean that if someone's dying or in need of help, I don't immediately go to their aid if they're not Armenian or Jewish or German, right? But that does mean that I can have special obligations to those broader groups. I think you can see that that's true for the family, right? And you can see that that's true for the nation. But if it's true for the family and the nation, then certainly what's stopping it from being true for the intermediary case of ethnicity?
No, I agree with that, but here again, I'm agreeing with all this stuff so far. But this is why I'm now defining it. This is the problem. So we agree on this hierarchy, ordered loves, but the thing is rightly ordered loves. Here's where it comes to the problem. Imagine I said to you, "Hey, honey, I have a duty to my third cousin. He's my kin. I mean, yeah, it's distant, but I have a duty to him. I got to go help him. I got to, he's kind of down on his luck. I'm going to go feed him." My wife says, "Honey, our kids are literally starving." I know, but I have an obligation to my third cousin.
Yeah.
So no, you're disordering your loves. Your primary obligation is to your own child. The Bible actually says that. The one who doesn't provide for his own relatives is worse than an unbeliever. So I cannot appeal to.
I 100% agree with that. 100% agree with that. Yeah. I 100% agree with you that family is, yeah.
Wait, hold on, Dave.
Well, I mean,
let Neil.
Go. I have a problem talking over people. I'm sorry. Neil, go ahead.
It's okay. So I'm just setting up. So I'm trying to show you we agree. So I agree with what you've said so far. Even though, and by the way, what we're saying right now is very anti-progressive. I think we agree with it. They kind of want to have this just universal love only, which I think is not biblical. We're not supposed to love everyone's wives or everyone's kids like we love our own.
Yeah,
that said, if you agree that we can have disordered loves by taking a distant duty and making it paramount over a more important duty, that's actually a sin. It's an excuse, basically, to not love our neighbor. Here's the problem. When I say I have a duty to that white guy in Portland, Oregon, that supersedes my duty to my literal next door neighbor who's black. Well, but see, I have a duty to my kin. No, my friend. Your next door neighbor actually has a greater claim on your loyalty and friendship and neighbor because he's your literal neighbor. That's Jesus' whole point. The Levite couldn't have been like that. Oh, the Samaritan could not have been, oh, that guy lying there on the ground, he's Jewish. I have kids at home. They need to be more than, or I have kin, my Samaritan kin, they're robbed too. The guy in front of you, Jesus says, he's your neighbor. Right. The one right in front of you. And so the point, so this is what I'm trying to show. Ironically, racism skeptics, I'm not saying it's you, just people that tend to be like, oh, this is all 20th century progressive nonsense, Marxist stuff. They're actually they often have a disordered love. They actually prefer random white people or random black people they've never met to the actual dude living next to them who's there, or their church. This is what really ticks me off, by the way, with the woke left. Again, sorry, Ben, one thing. The reason I use the phrase woke right, it's not as a slur. I'm trying to show you that. One reason I use it is because I'm trying to show you that so many of my objections to the woke right are exactly the same as my objections to the woke left. A lot of my followers on Twitter, they loved my objections to the woke left because they're on the right. They love those objections. Yeah, those are terrible woke left garbage. When I say, but the same thing actually is happening on the right side of the aisle, now they're angry at me. I'm like, guys, these are the same objections. The church was being torn apart, literally torn apart. We have stories by racial division because people were, especially blacks, frankly, were being told, you're oppressed, whites are oppressing you, and that was coming into the church. That's foul. That's got to stay out of the church. We can't, our whole point for 7 years was, you cannot walk in on church on Sunday and see your brothers and sisters in Christ, brothers and sisters, family, and be like, oppressor, 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 oppressed, oppressor, oppressed. That is trash. I was so angry at that. I saw it happening.
No, I totally agree that's very disruptive in multiracial communities, but it's not always so clear that just because if someone's like hurt or dying or in immediate need of help, who's my neighbor, I definitely need to render that help to them. But it's not so much so like, oh well, because I'm part of this town, therefore I can't go serve the nation. Sometimes I think it's much more complicated than you're letting on. There are obligations and there are ways that connect people to the more distant people sometimes in ways that they're not connected to the people who are necessarily geographically close to them. Here is an example. Not right now, but I've lived in cities. I've lived in cities all my whole life, and there have been people who lived right next to me that don't speak any English.
Mhm.
It is incredible. And obviously, I'd help them if they were hurting. But yeah,
Would
I
you
have to
vote
say I
for
do
dollars going from the government to them over to the government to programs that you would
but
want, right?
yeah, sure. It's not really like a moral thing, but you know, and you can imagine this even if you've ever lived in Europe, right? Like you literally drive away from your neighbors who are next to you, and you go across town to the people who speak your language,
Mhm.
because they have the ability to communicate with you in language, and it's not because you think your neighbors are bad. It's just that you're closer to them with this ability to communicate.
Right.
And the same thing is true for all elements of ethnicity. Uh, uh, it all creates a mosaic of history and symbology and symbolism that allows some people to communicate better with each other, even if they're massively culturally or geographically distant. And I think oftentimes that's what people really feel. I mean, if we're asking, okay, about racial division in particular in America, blacks and whites have, well, they don't always live close together, but they very often live close together, but they
Sure.
feel a much closer association with people of their own races. Well, that's because the races have history. And history
Mhm.
is what control is history is a language that allows you to communicate unexpressible things. Now, that does not mean that they necessarily see the person next to them as spiritually less, but it does mean that I have a very, very poor ability to communicate, possibly, with people who could be living very close to me because of divisions in language and ethnicity and race. And expressing that reality is not bigotry. It's not, right? Saying that I see myself more in the person who speaks English, has a common family history, and has a common ethnic tradition, and everything that goes with it, and perhaps common genetic lineage too. And I may have never met them. And my next door neighbor who speaks Vietnamese, and we tried to communicate via sign language in the hallway. Uh, you know, uh, they could be. I'm sure they're wonderful people, but that person is not going to have the same connection, even if I've met that woman 1,000 times and I've never met the person who has all these other different things in common with me. My pen pal across the continent. And I think that this is something. This is just a reality of how human anthropology works. Christians have been fine with this in the past, recognizing that there are these special connections, and I don't feel like I need to demand that African Americans see me as the same people. I don't think Black Americans see me as the same ethnic group, and that's totally fine with me. I'm totally fine that they have their own thing and they have a special connection with Black people everywhere, because there's this common piece of history. And this is actually one of the things, right? Like, African Americans, they're not lying when they say that they've had a unique experience in this country. And they're not lying when they say that it makes them feel connected to other African Americans, even other African Americans that they've never met before. Uh, I think we should acknowledge that and say that feeling is not bigotry. And I think we should acknowledge that feeling that African Americans have is not something. I mean, obviously, there probably is some ultimate good we could be doing that's better than that in some ideal sense. But I don't think that's what that Jesus was condemning in the parable of the Good Samaritan.
Well, let me just quickly say something. I see that this jump from the language barrier to suddenly other things a lot, but they're qualitatively different. Like, so
I
especially
disagree.
because wait, you literally can't communicate with someone who doesn't speak your language. If you can't, I mean, like a sign language. But the point is, if Vietnamese neighbor speaks Vietnamese and you speak English, you just can't communicate. But the
Are you a
idea that
Star
that's
Trek
just the
fan?
same
Are you a Star
used
Trek
to be,
fan?
yeah. Oh yeah,
If I said Shaka when the walls fell, would that mean anything to you?
that famous
There,
episode with
yeah, there's a
yeah,
famous
his arms
episode.
wide open. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
so,
I
so
saw
so
it.
there's these people, right? these alien, for the viewers who aren't nerds like we are, right? There are these people, an advanced alien race, and they in Star Trek they have universal translators, right? So when they say something, it all appears in English to them through these, the plot magic of television, right? But they discover that when they go to this alien race, even through the universal translators, their language is completely indecipherable. And that's because in this episode of Star Trek, I can't remember what the alien race was called. This alien race spoke completely in allegories. And unless you had a common history with them, there was no way that you could communicate with them because everything was referential. And the solution to the story was, Picard and the captain of the aliens have to go down and experience history together in order to have a common reference frame for their language. And my belief is that human ethnicity is like that. You're right. I can communicate in corporate speak to anybody, but the reason, like and I keep on going back to the African Americans. It's not just in African Americans' imagination when they talk about this historical experience of being African American in America, giving them a special ability to communicate. They're telling the truth about that, and the truth they're telling is the same truth as that truth from the Star Trek episode, famously, from The Next Generation. Human anthropology is much more complicated than just being able to speak the language like a large, like an AI LLM model.
Neil, I hear your objections to, I hear your point of view as a moral adherence to Christian principles. I just wonder how those translate into political action, especially in a democracy where collectivism is what wins. So how do people collectively decide what's in their best interests when it is kind of more or less a war of all against all, or at least all against the state, who's using all against all to get its way?
So one thing I wanted to say, this is a major point of my criticisms of the woke left also, is that it's not about politics for me. It never has been. My book, the first paragraph literally says this book's not about politics. It's the ideas that are dangerous. The ideas themselves. So I'd say here, I think a lot of people on the right are very political. It's a big thing for them, right? I am not here to say stop doing that. Stop being political. I couldn't care. I probably could care a little bit about your politics, but that's not a thing that I'm majorly concerned about. So if you're asking like, well, what about immigration? How do we build really? What's the really best way to organize our government? And that's not what I'm concerned about. What I'm concerned about is things like theological things, ideological things. So when it comes to ethnicity, just take immigration. I'm not here to tell you have lots of immigration, have zero immigration. That's not what I'm telling you that. I am here to tell you that, for example, in the current reality, we are living in America in 2025 now, right? Your next door neighbor, if he is, say, Black or Hispanic or Asian, whatever he is, right? You cannot refuse to love him or put the priority of some white dude you've never met. You can't prioritize that random guy over your next door neighbor, because if you had a perfect world, you'd be living in an ethno-state. It's like saying if my parents were Superman and Lois Lane, then I would live this way. But God does not care about your fantasy world. He cares about the real world and how you treat people in the real world. So that's my point, is that my focus has never been on politics. It's on what these ideas do, primarily to the church. And I saw this division caused by the woke ideas from the left, and I'm seeing, frankly, I'm seeing it, and many people are seeing it on the right. I said Doug Wilson said he's seeing racism, like not just, insensitivity. I can show you my Twitter feed where people are just coming on my wall talking about how I eat feces because I'm Indian. Go back to pooping on the streets, things like that. I'm like, this is not like subtle. Like, is it really racist? It's like people telling me I'm a dog, and go back. I'm like, I grew up in Delaware. I was born in California. My mom is Irish. It's just I'm seeing that stuff more and more. And I just briefly.
Yeah, you definitely say it way more than the 90s. It's gotten, the racialization has gotten way, but that is due to politics, though, right? That is.
Well, I think So I'd agree with Wilson. Wilson said that it's a lot, not all of it, at least some of it is a backlash against young white kids being told they're oppressors since they were age 3, right?
Oh
You
yeah.
tell
Oh
a
yeah, for
white
sure.
kid you're a garbage human being because you're a white male. You've only been oppressing. You live on stolen land. Pretty soon they say, I'm going to go find someone who's not going to beat up on me all the time, and it's the Nazis. but and but it's still wrong. Becoming a racist because hurt people. You can't just resort to being a race or ethnic partiality or bigotry, whatever you want to use.
Yeah.
It's not the solution, and we're seeing it. Sorry, one more thing. Um, two things on Twitter. Twitter's Twitter. It's different for everyone. It's not science. But a pastor named Mike Winger, he's a popular YouTuber. Sort of does lots of Bible studies. But he's very apolitical. He's a normie, right? He's not he's anti woke, but he says that's his thing. He talks about the Bible a lot. But a few months ago, he actually said on his Twitter channel, he asked a poll, is there a real problem among many conservative Christians who have embraced the same worldview as the woke left, but take the opposite positions? He didn't even use the term. I'm starting to suspect there is. We had a poll, and at 4,706 votes later, 2/3 of the people he polled said, yes, we're seeing a problem there. He didn't name it as the woke right. He just said, it's like the woke left, but the opposite is a problem. And then I did a poll also, and I'm all of my followers on Twitter, I did a poll, like 90% of them are evangelical Christians. And I said, I watched my friends get sucked into wokeness in 2019. It was terrible and rapid. I'm watching friends get sucked into the woke right today. It is also terrible and rapid. It had 200,000 views and 653 likes. And it was like not racial. It was like people were like, I see this too. People that I've experienced this too.
Dave, do you see that too? And what's your point of view? Because you are in the
me?
DR. You are in the DR, Dave. You got a lot
I mean,
of people who say a lot of
there's
things
a
around
vibe.
you. So there's a vibe.
So, I mean, there's
what do
been
we
a
do with that?
change.
Is that in alignment with your values?
Well, this is sort of where we have to distinguish. I mean, look, if someone calls you names for like the Indian hygiene thing, that's wrong, just as it would be wrong for someone to call me a Nazi, right? Even though some of my relatives might have been involved in some of that, so that I always joke, it's kind of true, kind of not.
Yeah.
But
comes up, though.
these are all. I mean, or what are the other things that people say about Germans? They eat babies.
You white
I don't
trash,
know.
or they call you whatever.
My family has not been in North America for very long. You might have been here for longer than I have. But I'm saying these sort of like slurs you experience online, I think we can just uniformly condemn that as bigotry. You could have gone back 100 years and people would understand that is not Christian behavior. It's not even high class behavior, right? And so I think we can, and most of that's probably from like 14-year-olds or just shit posters online, right? And there's people are way too comfortable just kind of like throwing tomatoes and like they're acting like peasants always have, right? But if you're talking about a vibe shift on a broader perspective, what is unmistakable, Neil, is that white America for the last 60 years has been highly individualistic, and right now the vibe in either its crude form or its intellectual form is, no, we feel like we have collective interests. We feel like we have collective heritage. And I say white not to talk about one type. I think there are many people who fall under this umbrella, but they're grouped there because of the left's narrative about the 20th century. And so people are saying now, for the first time in a very long time, no, there are collective things that we want to defend that are particular and have to be asserted at the highest levels. And I think that is what's creating. And now if you're talking about woke rightism being shit posters throwing ethnic slurs, I 100% sympathize. If you're complaining about people looking at these issues from a collective angle now, I think it's unavoidable. I don't know how you walk that back, or even necessarily if we should. because I think that, like I said before, all of the problems we're having with race in these modern multicultural democracies directly have to do with collectives and collective power. And furthermore, this is Yarvin's point, and it's also my opinion, democracy makes that more prominent, not less prominent, because
Inevitable.
democracy is a group block game. If you don't vote in block, if you don't vote with your race, this is something that Lee Kuan Yew said in Singapore. Lee Kuan Yew said, I live in a multiracial city-state. He said nation. And in multiracial nations, you vote your race, not your ideas or your conscience, every single time. And the West used to be more or less homogenous. Now it's not, and there's not. We're not going to have a politics that is everyone else votes in block, everyone else has ethnic identity except for people of European origin. That is not going to happen. And once they do start seeing themselves that way, that's going to trigger a whole heck of a bunch of other questions about the last 60 years and the ideology that got us here. And I would like to have that conversation in a way that minimizes harm and maximizes well-being for all races. But I don't think there's a way out of that conversation.
Neil, do you find, are you wary of the collectivism along racial lines? Is that acceptable or unacceptable? I know it's not necessarily Christian, but it seems like it is Christian because Christ embraced his Jewishness.
Right. I think there are several things here. So one is, this is where it's really important to distinguish between race and ethnicity. It's not splitting hairs. Because the biblical term is ethnos. It sort of means people group. So people with a shared language, culture, heritage, right? So that's why blacks are rightly viewed as they're an ethnos in the biblical sense. They have a shared language, history, and they're always outlying cases.
So you're saying African American isn't a race, but the way Americans use that, it is.
Yeah.
So that's just confusing language, then, right?
No. Well, I'll explain why. So people group refers to, it's sociology. You look it up. This is not. I'm not making this up.
I know you're not, but I think this. But what we are creating is we're creating a difference between how this creates a natural Mott and Bailey, because now there's a massive difference between how people ordinarily use the words and how we're using them right now. And African Americans are a race in most people's understanding. Yeah, are white Americans like an ethnos then?
So this is exactly why I'm making the distinction. Okay. So call it people group then. Forget race, forget ethnicity, call it people group. That's a word that sociologists use, missionaries use it, people group. Shared language, culture, history, ancestry, people group. Are blacks a people group? I would argue that, yes, they're a people group. They're brought from Africa.
Okay, are whites a people group?
Various tribes. Here's the problem. White Americans are, this is why racial categories are such stupid things. Because if you go to Africa, and this actually happened, I had a pastor who went to Africa, he's black here. He goes to Africa, and apparently the people there who didn't speak his language were whispering, like, is that guy black? Like, to them, he looked like a white guy because he's like a little shade lighter than him. But he's going to like a purely African nation. I forget where it was. So we think
this is what this is, in my opinion, this is why we should treat all of these things as kind of like a continuum of the same thing, right? I think that trying to split hairs and say one thing is good and one thing is bad, let's just treat it all as ethnicity. There can be larger ones, there can be smaller ones. It's just all ethnicity, okay. Right? And if you're saying that like you'd rather have people have smaller ethnicities, that's a very legitimate point. But I think trying to divide ethnicity from race is almost statistically impossible.
But here's why. So, for example, it is though. So if you have, we see this. You can have. It was more prominent in like the early 1900s. You'd have enclave like Little Italy. They were Italians. They'd speak Italian. In the U.S. today, you have people that are Mexican Americans. These are hyphenated Americans. But that we recognize that, yeah, there's a real sense that there's like they have a unique culture, sometimes a unique language. Korean Americans often speak Korean at home, go to Korean schools after school as they perpetuate the language. So there is ethnicity there. Well, that's why these labels like Asian, they sweep all of like dozens of countries speaking different languages at war with each other. They're all Asian. Yeah. But that's a very American thing. Whereas you go to like these countries, they're like, no, we're Japanese. They're Korean. They don't like each other. It's like there's bigotry there sometimes, But my point is this.
Like
It's not wrong to say-
even by that measure, even Indian isn't one race. It's like many.
That's right. Yeah. Go to India, you'll find there's caste systems. There's
but then when they come to North America, they're all Indians, and this is why. But this is just how the thing is that these smaller ethnicities, while they're very divided when they're next to each other, when they move to heavily multiracial or multicultural societies, they group up in these larger kind of stupider groups. So, Koreans and Chinese people might hate each other in Asia, but they're all part of the same like coalition in the Berkeley student government. And Italians and Irish, I guess they didn't really historically hate each other, but they're very different people. They were all part of the same like white Catholic identity in New York, and the Irish Italian paling is like it's a stereotype in the Eastern United States, and later they got assimilated into the white category that the United States government was trying to do in the 20th century, right, or the first half at least.
So my only problem is that not my only problem. I think the main problem is that if you go, and it's changing now because there's so much fluidity, and even with actually interracial marriage happening, like there is just a blending. We have a whole chapter in our book on this because it is a mess. What I would argue, and actually interesting, I'm going to actually quote from Stephen Wolf's book, A Case for Christian Nationalism. He's a Christian nationalist who's been accused of a lot of racism. In fact, he just has. I'm not saying he is. I'm just saying that's descriptive. But he would actually say, no, America is an ethnos itself. Why? We have, as Americans, a shared heritage. Blacks have been here since the birth of America, before the birth of the United States. They are Americans. They speak the same language. Our culture, think about how much
America has never been one ethnos. It's always been multiple ethnoses.
So there's something called ethnogenesis. Ethnic groups.
Yeah, I know, but that hasn't happened yet. That has to. So, if that's going to occur, it has to occur in the future.
That's one. It's not clear that it hasn't. And that, so take
white ethnogenesis, something like that did occur, which is why you could kind of sort of squint your eyes and say that there's a white American ethnicity in the United States, because between 1880 or 1870 and 1960, the American government put all of its resources into making sure all non-Black Americans were one ethnicity and saw themselves that way as much as humanly possible.
But you don't think there's ethnogenesis for Black Americans?
Wars, what?
Well, aren't Black Americans also the unique ethnos at least?
Well, no, the Black Americans were explicitly excluded by the federal government during that time.
No, but I'm just saying, but they don't have to be in charge. They're just like, they have that. You're talking about the solidarity. They have a shared history. I agree with that, actually.
But
Black Americans.
But this is we're back to our original top down versus bottom up. The ethnogenesis occurred in white America because the elites were saying we need to get all non-Blacks into one ethnicity so that we can be like France or England and be like one nation together, and then excluding African Americans and some Native American tribes that they felt weren't properly mixed with white Americans at that time. And that's what created the ethnogenesis. There has not really been an ethnogenesis between Blacks and whites in this country yet. I mean, maybe there could be, right? But I'm not saying there hasn't been.
Well, I agree there was no top-down ethnogenesis for Blacks, but there was an ethnogenesis. This is why they have, like you talked about, the shared history, the shared culture, these nonverbal things. Yeah, okay.
But they don't. They don't. This has been the stumbling block, and it's nothing against African Americans. It's nothing against them, but they do not see themselves landing on Plymouth Rock. I mean, look, my family came here in the 70s. And when I went to school, I saw myself as one of the pilgrims. African Americans don't, and even though I came here hundreds of years after the African Americans came in, via slave ships, but the propaganda of the American government made it so that like all white people are part of this like Massachusetts Plymouth Rock project. There is no concept of that in the African American community. They do not see themselves as,
once Netflix does the Plymouth Rock landing, everybody's going to find their identity.
it's kind of funny, right? Because all of that woke stuff it almost is like an attempt to do that, but it doesn't understand human anthropology well enough to understand how that would have to be done, even to try to propaganda force it down people's throats.
I'm confused here. So there's like a black national anthem that gets a lot of like negative press sometimes, but they're not an ethnic. They're not an ethnos. They're not a people group.
They are.
Why?
They are.
They are. You're
What?
saying they are.
Of course they are. No, I'm
Oh,
saying
okay.
they're not the same. I'm saying they're not this. I'm saying there's not an American.
They're distinct,
ethnos.
but they're still within within the American history.
African Americans are more American than I am, like way more
Right.
American.
Yeah. Okay. Now. Okay. Sorry, I was misunderstanding that.
What I'm saying is like
but they're more African American than American.
Yeah, because they see their history. When they look back and say, "What is the story of being African American?" Their story looks like, I hate to use this example, it looks like Roots, right? Which is itself, Roots is propaganda, right? A lot of things were exaggerated, right? But that is the image that African Americans have of their history, and it is not the same history that white Americans imagine. And that difference in historical understanding is, it creates a separate ethnos, and that's what divided the Samaritans from the Jews, or the Jews, the Judeans, right? I mean, like the Samaritans were literally descendants of Abraham; they were literally followers of the Torah. What the distinction had to do with the Babylonian exile, and the story is told around that. And because that story was different, they could not mix. And these different histories create different symbolic languages for how people understand political formulas, and this has to be, like I said, it's not a good or a bad thing. This reality has to be respected. And to quote Nicolas Cage from The Rock, the second you don't respect this thing, it kills you.
Yeah, but the idea of America is, and always has been, or almost always has been, at least in our lifetimes, been bigger than the ethnic and the historical threads within America.
Yeah.
So there are these distinct things. Right. And every once in a while, there's a quote unquote racial reckoning where this history is like 2020. It was a rebooting of the history of the whites and the blacks, a simplification of it. And then, in my opinion, a disharmonious, absolute power grab that wasn't based on a shared, mutually prosperous teleology or outcome, but it was still like under the umbrella of America. And it was weird because Britain was kneeling. Everybody was like the global American empire. We're all doing the same ritual with George Floyd, which goes back to an earlier point. Just really quick.
Yeah, sure.
Another problem that I see with the Samaritan story is that with modern technology, everybody is our next door neighbor, depending on how the media narrative makes that a close thing. So George Floyd was one moment in Minneapolis, but it shook the entire world where everybody thought that George Floyd was their next door neighbor, right? Because of the collapsing of geographical space, and then the prioritizing in a perverse way of ethnic difference and ethnic oppression narrative. So that Good Samaritan story, I don't know how it scales to modern technology because everything feels so much closer to us. Anyways.
Sorry, Ben. America has always been a multi-ethnic state. That it's always been that, and it's a rich in the first iteration of America. The dream of the founders we're going to have multiple ethnicities, but we will separate via space. So everyone will, all the ethnicities will have their own little states, or maybe there'll be new ethnicities or mixtures of the old European ones, or maybe even mixtures of African and Indian peoples, right? But they'll all have their own little space, and they'll be able to keep each other out. After the Civil War, the American government decided that it didn't like that idea, and it wanted to melt everyone down into one giant ethnicity. And then except for blacks. And then when we tried to do this for Africans, the whole project kind of melted down because the project became so large and includes so many different peoples and tried to transgress so much history that it could possibly keep a story of itself about what is America straight, while at the same time trying to integrate people who saw themselves as having radically different histories. And this is not my main opinion, but it is my humble opinion, and I submit this as not being proven. That essentially the original way of trying to use space to dissolve ethnic disagreements is probably the right way to resolve these problems, and there needs to be a re-territorialization, so people are reacting to their actual neighbors and not to, you know, George Floyd thousands of miles away or whatever, right?
Wait, so you want to? I mean, okay? I want to be pejorative, but it's an ethno state. You want ethnos to have their own states.
Well,
I don't know how to
and
describe that.
all states will be ethno states eventually, because if they're one people over a long enough time frame, they will
Yeah.
intermarry with each other and become a new ethnos. So
Right.
it's kind of when people are, do you like ethno states? It's kind of a misnomer, because if I had an ethnos that was perfectly divided between 50-50 Africans and Europeans, I would leave them alone for 100 years, and then they would be a half African ethno
Right.
state.
It has happened in history. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
it is. So I mean, like, under enough stability, all states eventually become ethno states because of ethnogenesis, right?
Right.
So it's not such an own to say, oh, you believe in ethno states. I believe in stable states, and because of the stability, they will eventually develop their own ethnicities. So
Sure.
I don't think I'm being too controversial.
No. Just I find it helpful to refer to people groups. Again, that's why it's sort of it's a neutral term. What you're saying is that if you put everyone in a box with a border for 100 years, they form a new people group.
Yeah.
Right? That's just what you're saying. They do. I kind of agree, and I think what we're seeing this is what again Wolf argues in his book, that we already are, because we have had this 300 years of shared history. We are an American ethnos, and that includes the Black African American peoples, is that they are part of America. Yes, they were kept out of the nation's history. Yes, they did develop, their own history because they were segregated. But even then, though, there has, and especially in the last 60 years, there has been a push to recognize, no, we're American together. And yes, there's going to be friction as we try to undo all of the harm that Blacks did actually face for hundreds of years. But I think that then the goal should be, like you're saying, let's form a new ethnos in America. We're seeing I think this is happening.
I think that this project's going to fail. It's too religiously divided. Yeah, go ahead.
The first thing is that I think the long-term goal should be, let's be one people. I'm not saying that, yes, everyone has to pick up interracial marriage and just go for it. No, I'm just saying, look, let's just be committed to be Americans together. And the second thing is this,
I cannot be one people with the people in Berkeley, California that think children can change their sex. I cannot be one people with that. And that's just the most extreme case. And there's going to be an ethno break on that, at least. And that's part of a long list of things that, like, because human ethnicity is based on narratives, and part of that narrative is constructed around a genetic lineage too, right? But it's much more father to son and much less like 23andMe. It's much less autistic. It's much more like you have the paternal line, right? That is what creates the story, right? And so the sort of genetic autists from the 19th century kind of missed the mark on that one, right? But it's a component, right? There can't be a common narrative between my worldview and the worldview of any number of people that are either newcomers to the continent who come from radically different cultures and radically different religions, or from the newfangled religion that we had pop into existence in the last 20 years that I guess we're not calling it woke anymore, because now woke means like Gramsci. but this sort of John, like we call it John Lennonism, like from the Beatles or whatever, this sort of Berkeley religion that sprung into existence, I have no ability to forge a common ethnicity with that. My stories make no sense in that language.
Okay, I'll keep this brief. This is exactly why I think the idea of you vote with your ethnicity or this white solidarity is just not. I don't think it's a mistake. It's just not true. You do not. If you're an evangelical Christian, you do not have this deep-seated worldview compatibility, this narrative compatibility with the gender fluid Antifa member in Portland. You just don't. It's crazy to say like, well, but they're white like me. We're gonna vote together. No, you'd better not.
But it's the Lee Kuan Yew quote, and I know it's religion and race, and there 100% has been that what you're saying and the breakdown of white America. It's not really. It hasn't shattered into 1,000 pieces. It's divided into two camps. And one camp follows the old Christian ways, and with a few weird pagan groups in the wings, and the other camp follows this new kind of atheistic social justice, Christianity without God religion that emerged in the 20th century. This is a religious division. I don't expect like Indian Muslims and Indian Hindus to vote in the same way in India. I know they don't. It's not just race, but race and religion will dictate this. And if you have a huge religious division in your country, good luck getting ethnogenesis going. I have no idea how to resolve this. Like it's beyond resolution at this stage.
We kind of went past the whole white solidarity thing, but this is the reason why I think it's not even a fallacy or pipe dream. It's just stupid because you're saying there actually are totally different ethnos within the white ethnos because these are totally different ways of viewing the world. It's different religions. It's like having Hindus and Muslims trying to get along, but they're all white. But the second thing I say is you said you vote with your race and religion. It just is that's the way it is, and I guess it's the way it should be. But this is why I want to divide between politics.
It's statistical,
and
but yes, yeah.
Yeah, but I want to distinguish between politics and theology here. Politically, you might have the theory that says everyone votes with their it just happens that way. It's just a fact of life. Okay, maybe it's true, maybe it's not true. I'm not a pollster. I know the trends, but I would say we don't dictate what should be from what is. That Christianity is a narrative. You're saying, where's this shared narrative? Christianity gives you one. It is shared. No, you don't share a history as a people necessarily. But there is something even more deeply unifying than the story of your personal ethnos in the North American continent. It's a story of God's people throughout history. And I get the objections of you can't have a shared ethnos with people who don't speak your language, but we do. And this is why I think the focus on race in America, whether it's on the left or the right, is flipping the biblical priorities.
I think you could. Yeah, go ahead.
So this is why I was so anti-woke, because the church has to be your primary allegiance. I get, yes, but if you speak Korean and I speak, Cantonese and you speak, I get that. But we all speak English.
This is an old conflict called the Ghibellines versus the Guelphs in Dante's time, right?
Yeah, right.
Can you have allegiance? Right? Well, no. Dante. Florence all of Europe was riven by this conflict between the Ghibellines and the Guelphs. And the Guelphs believed that the highest political authority was the Pope. And you had to have total political loyalty to the Pope. And the kings were just people who, like the Pope, put the crowns on, right? And the Ghibellines believed that there was a dual mandate, essentially. And Dante was a Guelph, but he sympathized with the Ghibellines, and he believed
like
that
Star Trek.
It's like Star Trek. I was going to say that. Yeah,
it does. Well, I mean, give me a break. This is history. but Christians have it was believed for the last, and this is not universal throughout Christian history, but for the last 1,000 years, it was believed that Christians could be Christian and also loyal to their nations, and that these were non-competing magisteria. This was the conclusion of the Reformation. If we want to kind of undo this and go back to like Christendom, and like America is an extension of Christendom, I kind of I'm down with that funky jam a little bit, but it's a pretty big deviation from how we've conceptualized nation states. And America is not a Christian country, right? Like that's like we can't become like the United States of well, what are the feminists always afraid of? Gideon, the Republican Gideon, whatever they call it. Gilead. That's it. That's it. Right. Yeah. I mean, but so I mean, so there's the problem is I'm not so like if we want to say that the new nation is the international nation of Christianity,
no, I'm talking about within America. So this is. So I'm not saying that you can't be loyal to the United States. You got to be loyal to all Christians everywhere. I'm saying within the primary loyalty you have is spiritual. And I get, yes, I can't have fellowship with some guy I don't speak his language. He lives in Tibet. But what we're talking about here, we're talking about in this country. We're talking about your next door neighbor, the guy who goes to church with you. We have that solidarity has got to be more than, but he's not my race. It's got to be. It's got to be. That's the story we're telling. Is that we are God's people together.
But Neil, this is can I hate to draw history in again too, but like this is so subtle here, right? Because let's go back to the fall of the Roman Empire and people like Boethius, right? So Boethius was a Neoplatonist Christian, and he's working for all of these like barbarian kings. Like so, all of these people. They're half all of these people they're half Christian and half pagan. That was how these societies were set up. And so the thing is that one way to conceptualize, and the way I think of ethnic loyalty as a Christian is, okay, so I'm German and I'm a Christian. Let's just say I'm Goth. They weren't Germans back then. Goth. I'm an Ostrogoth.
Goth Dave timeline. We'd love to see it.
And then to the south of me are Romans that are like 99% Christian or Catholic, right? I don't start like trying to subvert my nation because it's only 50% Christian in favor of the neighbors. I have a responsibility to try to convert my neighbors to Christianity. And my ethnic loyalty says that just like I have a special responsibility to the person who's next to me geographically, because they're close to me, I also have a special responsibility to the people who are close to me ethnically, because I can use my shared history, my shared genetics, my shared language to communicate to them better about the ultimate goodness of God, rather than people who are far away from me, like the Armenians, which are all Christian, but are radically different from me in terms of ethnicity. That is how I think. And because of that, I have a responsibility to the northern Italian Ostrogoths more than I do the nation of Armenia. That's sort of a very stilted example, but you see how that plays out historically speaking, even, right?
But again, none of those loyalties confer more duties to you than the fact that you're living next to an Austrian or a fellow God. You know what I'm saying? Or that you're going to church and worshiping with them. If the local community of the church, no, but that's my point. In America, we all speak English. I mean, not everybody, but if you're in a local church and you're speaking English, you're taking communion with them. This is supposed to be your family, and this is. I get you want to talk about politics. I get that's the jam of the new right and the dissident right, but I want to keep pulling us back to what the Bible does. Look, the Bible does not talk a lot about politics, like very little, except to obey the authorities. It's all it says. Obey the king, obey the authorities, honor them. But it's focused intensely on.
Not talking about like the Old Testament and all the
no, New
what
Testament
happened in Canaan.
Oh, sorry, you're talking about the Old Testament, yeah.
But we keep going back and forth because I agree to render under Caesar's, right? So like, but this conversation started off by saying that your primary political loyalty was to Christianity, but now you seem to be saying that Christianity is parallel to politics. I feel like we kind of agree and we're talking past each other here, because the political authority is often specifically ethnic, as it was at the fall of the Roman Empire, right? The religious authority and the spiritual authority is higher, but also does not necessarily directly push on politics as much.
Okay, let me try to reframe this. So you're saying, look, in the political realm, right? We're just going to basically vote with religion and race. It's just going to happen. It's inevitable. It's going to be that way. How can we mitigate the
That will be
harm
the
and
pull.
maximize the good? Right.
That will be the
And
pull. That will be the pull.
And Neil, you're
Unless you,
talking here
yeah.
about right. And Neil, you're talking here about the spiritual realm, where yeah, sure, I can have interethnic churches, and we're all brothers and sisters in Christ. That's a separate track. But what I'm saying is, if you prioritize the actual on the ground, you are brothers and sisters in Christ, and I have black and white and Asian people at my church. We all meet together, worship together. If that's actually happening, and that's again, that's non-negotiable. That's a command. We can't say, well, I don't like that. No, that's what God's calling you to do. You go to church, preach the gospel.
I understand. I am totally cool with interethnic churches. I think that's fine.
Right.
That would be the basis. If you wanted to have an ethnogenesis, that would be like step one. Now there's like 100 more steps you need to do, but if you wanted to have ethnogenesis, that's you'd have to start there. That's always the beginning. So I'm not saying that's not going to happen, but I guess I don't see what your point is. You're still going to have these divisions, and furthermore, if you do not have that religion, America is not mono faith. Let's be clear about that.
Right. Oh, of course.
It is absolutely not. So while you could create a kind of, I mean, it won't be multiracial for long, as I keep on saying, because people will intermarry, but like, you can create like a new race based around a church that will be a mixture of the previous ones, and that's most countries in Europe, like from the very time that I'm referencing, right? You can do that. That is not a solution for an American ethnogenesis. And in the meantime, those new ethnicities, people will start voting along those lines.
Okay. Well, my primary objection though is that I just don't want to bring these political theories, which might be true, they center ethnicity, say. It's a primary identity, it's primary voting block. I don't want to bring those into the church where they don't belong. And that's what happened with the left. The left was all about politics and racial politics and identify with your racial group, and that came into the church and destroyed it.
Okay, but
we can't do that.
Look, the church has to try to maintain separation from politics. I 100% agree. That's why I'm very reluctant to talk about my adherence to the Catholic Church and my various. People always ask me to discuss my political disagreements with the Pope, and I always try to resist that because of this. I 100% agree that politics stays out of the church, but we are talking about America, the political project, correct? Mm-hmm. And there will be downstream effects of that from the church, and there certainly will be downstream effects of that from race and ethnicity. So let's just leave aside Christianity altogether then and just focus on America, the political project. There cannot be do we agree that there cannot be an American ethnogenesis in the foreseeable future?
Probably, yeah.
Okay. So therefore, separate collectives will be the political order of the day in the Lee Kuan Yew sense.
Well, if you're right.
As regrettable, but
I'll grant that. I'm not a political theorist, so I'll just sure say it's true. Okay.
Okay, great. So the problem is, and I don't like this is we keep on hitting up against this reality. This is the reason why people in my position are so skeptical of democracy. Is people are going to start to look at their race and ethnicity as collectives, and they're going to start asking collective questions, and this is where we kind of get to the unavoidable, like the sort of James Lindsay individualism is not going to answer a bunch of questions that America has to answer going forward. And as much as I would like to just live in a Christian country, well, specifically a Catholic country, but I'm not going to quibble over that. As much as I just like to live in that environment, we're going to have to negotiate these collective differences and boundaries.
one thing I haven't really challenged the whole political Lee, whatever that guy was, Lee Kwan something.
He
I
was
haven't challenged
he
it.
was
Yes
the
or no.
leader of Singapore. So he's the
Okay.
Singapore. Yeah.
So let me just say just two things briefly. Let's say one thing is that his theory is just it's the way it's going to happen. It's not going to be. It's unavoidable. But
He didn't like it. He didn't like it. He was just saying,
but
yeah.
one thing is that let's just distinguish between what is and what ought to be. What if voting and what ought voting to be biblically? Voting is how you love your neighbor. Voting is the one mechanism to love your neighbor. It's only one, but it's just you should be. How should I love my neighbor? And who's your neighbor? Neighbor is people around you, but people around you are different ethnicities. So in an ideal world, again, we're not there, but in an ideal world, what we ought to do is vote for the common good. And I get that, but my personal group's good might be the bad. There's competition, but if I look as I should at reality, I'm not in it just for my people, my group, my whatever. I'm in it. Well, what's best for everybody? There's trade-offs, but I'm not just thinking I want to get my piece of the pie at the expense of everybody else. That's what we ought to do. Number one, but then number two. So I'm just saying we ought to do that. But then number two. But how would you get people to do that? Like, come on, give me a break. No one's going to vote for the common good. They vote for their own family, put money in their pockets. I get that. How would you go about creating people?
Well, actually, there's one more problem before that. That's a good problem, but the one that is before that, we don't agree on the common good. That's the one that's killing us right now.
I'm going to solve both problems.
It is not necessarily that. First of all, there's the trust problem, which is natural to multi-ethnic states. The second thing is the definition problem. This has been remarkably apparent to everybody in the modern world is that we do not agree on moral problem solutions anymore. I talked to local dissidents about this for an hour. I'm sure Ben's tired of that, but yeah, but that's the problem, right?
And
so I'll solve both problems.
Yeah. Okay.
So one, how do you get? If only we could get people to vote for the common good, not just for their tribe. But okay, we'd like that.
Yeah.
I won't do it. How do we get that happening in the political sphere? And how would we get people to actually agree on the moral good? We can't even agree on what that is. The church. In the church, if we're all agreeing it's interethnic, it should be, or can't. It doesn't have to be. If you're in Idaho, you're all white, but whatever. So if you're in Manhattan, you're going to have an interethnic church. That's where you begin to see people as friends across racial lines, and you build a sense of the common good. I want what's best for you. Might you're be inclined to be like, what's for my tribe, but in the church, who becomes your tribe? You begin to see things in terms of actually no. I want this for my Christian brothers and sisters. You begin to see things outside the lens of race and ethnicity and class and even gender. That's where you build this desire for the common good. And that's how you and a common moral framework. Because in the church, we're being taught from the Bible, we're learning, oh no, men can't become women. Oh no, divorce is actually bad for people. We begin to think those things in the church, and then we go out into society and we vote that way. Now again,
I do pray that America evolves into a Christian nation over the next 1,000 years. But we're talking about a time frame of centuries. Like to put this into context, right?
Yeah. So, my point is,
yeah.
I'm telling you what we ought to do. What is going to happen? I don't know. I'm not a prophet. I'm just saying to you, this is what, and God's vision for what happens it actually ends up solving that problem. If we are acting it the way we should in the church, building these friendships and family relationships across lines of race, class, gender, whatever, then and having a common moral narrative, then we begin to vote for the common good, not just for our tribe. So both those problems are actually solved by whether or not it does solve
people don't vote for the common good. We have to act for the common good. Christians have to act for the common good. And one of the ways we act for the common good is by being realistic. And nobody has ever thought historically or during the time of the founding fathers that people spontaneously vote, especially irreligious people, vote spontaneously for the common good. That doesn't happen. So the responsible way to govern the country is to figure out actually how to govern a post-Christian country, which is unfortunately the problem we have in front of us. What?
You would vote for the common good, wouldn't? I mean, You don't just vote for what's good for
I
your
don't really
person.
vote, but but I mean, I have voted on occasion for local leaders, yes, and I attempt to vote for the good, of course, by Christian definition, the good of the community.
The actual good. Yeah, but the Christian good is the actual good of the community. As Christianity is true.
There was a super chat about how you would deal, or how this Christian state would deal with people who are not Christians.
Right. Yeah. This is the whole Christian nationalism discussion. I wanted to actually say something too. I get that some people do use the phrase woke right just as a slur. I get that. They just use it as a slur. Other people other people use the phrase woke right to refer to anything post-liberal, anything that's not individualistic, anything that's just not liberal. It's woke right. I don't use it that way. I talked about this being. I use it to refer to basically Christian, or not Christian. I use it to refer to people on the right who are adopting critical theory as a framework and method. But let me give you I made a list on Twitter. Actually, where is it? A list of things you could say that are post-liberal but are not woke right, in my opinion. You could argue that liberalism is bad because it emphasis on individualism erodes the social fabric. Emphasis on autonomy undermines duty, loyalty, authority. Egalitarianism makes social engineering inevitable. Rights discourse reduces entitlement. Unbridled capitalism. I made these up. I'm glad you're saying yes. I would not call any of those. Institutional neutrality is a myth. You're always going to have some values that you support. Pluralism encourages relativism. Unbridled capitalism leads to greed and materialism. All of those things are not woke right. Right? They're post-liberal. I'm not going to call them woke right. Woke right for me is referring to something different. Okay. The question is, how do you govern non-Christians? The other thing with Christian nationalism, which I'm opposed to, I'm not opposed to it in principle. If you want to go to Mars and create a Presbyterian colony on Mars, go for it. I'm not one of those guys who's just like, no, Christianity there's no Christian nationalism is always bad everywhere. No, go found a Presbyterian Martian colony. How do you govern non-Christians? That's a good question, and it's one that I'm agnostic about, genuinely. I take an incrementalist and pragmatic approach to my politics, which is I don't know the ultimate awesomest thing in the whole universe. I guess when Jesus comes back as king, that will be the ultimate government. Great.
Yeah.
But beyond that, I'm not saying we need to have a monarchy, we should have a democracy, we should have an oligarchy. I'm not even saying that. I'm just saying I can take one step forward towards what is better than what we have. So for me, the big priority in my politics is get rid of abortion, get rid of gender, LGBTQ stuff. I think we should overturn Obergefell. Things like that. These are small steps. I'm not speculating about this ideal Christian prince. So in terms of how do you govern non-Christians, for me personally, I'm just saying I would push for policies that are for the common good. You may not agree with those as the common good. You may say that's not the common good. But I'm saying, but if Christianity is true, it is. So abortion hurts the common good because it kills babies. So we should get rid of it. Divorce is bad for people. We should, again, can you get rid of it totally? Probably not. So incrementalist approach. So for me, I know people have this vision of Gilead and the Handmaid's Tales in their mind. And what I'm saying is, though, my political approach to governing non-Christians is always incremental. And it's because of democracy, it's through persuasion. I want to persuade people that it's bad to mutilate healthy young girls. And I think here's the funny thing, we're seeing that. We can see that the vibe shift as people realize what we're doing. We see a shift in abortion attitudes towards it, with culminated in the overturning of Roe versus Wade and Dobbs. So my only point is, how do you govern? I don't have a theoretical answer, like here's how you do it. I'm saying here's the steps that I would take towards a more just nation, which will promote the good of everyone. Now, you may not think it does, but I think as a Christian, I do think it does.
Okay, there's a super chat here. I guess
1 second. I promised my wife I'd be done at the top of the hour, so we have 4 minutes.
Okay.
And Jay brings up a good question, but you guys can riff on this or ignore it and do your closing closing arguments. Jay Burton super chatted. Thanks, Jay, for showing up. Who decides the common good? I don't know if that's something that's salient to what we're talking about. And I would add, what does the woke right? Is that useful in building a coalition, or is it not? So, you guys
who decides the common good? I would say God.
How about you go first? Yeah, well, I agree.
I
with
mean,
that,
God
yeah.
decides the common good, right? And then how do you reach it? Well, we're stuck with democracy right now, so we get people to vote for the common good, and you can do that for various ways. And I think the way that I would use personally is persuasion, reason with them. I know you have, or you're like, well, no, you have to have elites. Well, in your fantasy world, I guess you can install a Christian prince and get him to dictate the laws to everybody. But in the real world, right now, persuasion.
Yeah, I mean, this is this is one weird thing about us, Neil, is we agree on the big things. We just disagree on the practical dimensions of the thing. Democracy is managed public opinion. And so saying that we should vote on the common good means that the government's propaganda instruments should decide the common good. And I can't agree to that. I think if I'm going to turn this into my closing statement or something approximating it, I think that the reason why the woke right thing is so that statement about public opinion being formed by power is more or less what we've defined in this conversation as woke. That reality needs to be central in our discussions about how to manage the American future for the common good. I do not know how we talk about the common good without us being aware just the extent to which media blitzes and elite power can mold public opinion. And I agree. What we're seeing in the vibe shift is right now the myths of the 20th century fading away, basically because the mainstream media has lost power. That's what's created this vibe shift. Christianity has never been weaker in this country. I think it's going to have a little bit of a resurgence, but it hasn't even stopped bleeding yet. And it's lost, even in my lifetime, it's lost an enormous amount of its power and popular appeal. And Christians like us, myself Catholic and you, people who are interested in exerting power or managing politics as Christian actors, Christian princes, as Hobbes would say. Well, I think he said Christian commonwealths, but whatever. We need to think about how we can realistically manage this time, such as to spread the gospel and also secure the survival of the people. For America, that is going to need to involve coming up with a way of managing multiple religions and multiple ethnicities and realizing that people will vote based on first their identities that they get from their ethnos, then also from what the media and the powerful tell them ideologically. And I think we need to have a system that takes those energies and puts it to ends that are socially useful for the good that I think we kind of agree on.
Neil, did you have a comment for that?
Oh no, I was looking at the other question about governing, but I can
Go. You can take either one.
I saw the question was, governing is more than Okay.
But I have to feed my family, or
Okay.
I have to eat with them.
Feed your family, Ben. I'm sorry.
Dave and Neil, thank you very much for swinging by. Why don't we plug our works?
Excellent. Well, yeah, go ahead.
Neil's in the middle of it.
I have two links I think you're going to supply them. One is to my article about the woke right. What is it? How do you define it? How do you identify it? The other is to a book on the neo-Marxist right, which is published this year by scholars who are progressive. And they point out there are people saying we're going to embrace Gramsci on the right. It's not like a pipe fantasy invented by people on the internet. It's a real thing in the world. So it's good. It's gratifying to read the book because I'm not making this up basically. But if you disagree, read the book review.
Excellent. Thanks, Neil, so much for coming on, discussing this. It was a lot of fun. I respect your desires because I share a lot of them. And I just wanted to thank you for being honest and taking all my criticisms in good faith. But I'm Dave Greene. I write a blog called Letters from Fiddler's Green, and I have a YouTube channel called The Distributist, like Hilaire Belloc. Anyway, that's all I have to plug. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very, very much. Thanks for everybody for joining us. And sorry for the short end, but that's the show.
All right.
Ciao.